My name is Brooklyn. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been the quiet one in my family. I live in Seattle now, work in financial operations for a mid-sized healthcare company, and most people who meet me describe me the same way. Steady, practical, reliable. I don't interrupt. I don't argue loudly. I don't post cryptic messages online. If there's conflict in a room, I'm usually the one refilling water glasses or quietly stepping outside until the volume lowers. What people often mistake, though, is silence for absence. They assume that because I don't react publicly, I'm not noticing privately. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing anyone for sport. It's about documentation, about patience, about what happens when a narrative gets built around you, slowly, repeatedly, until one day you realize that if you don't correct it, it will calcify into truth. For 10 years, I sent money to my parents every single month. No announcements, no dramatic sacrifices posted online, no strings attached. And then one afternoon, a cousin I barely speak to sent me a message that began with, "I can't believe you refused to help them." That was the first time I understood that a different version of me had been circulating at family gatherings. A version where I was distant, ungrateful, absent, the daughter who moved away and forgot. This video is the full story of how that narrative formed, why I stayed quiet for so long, and what happened when I finally chose not to argue, but to present records. It's about family dynamics that don't look explosive on the outside, about being assigned a role so early that you don't even realize you're performing it, about how generosity, when done quietly, can be rewritten by the loudest storyteller in the room. And it's about what happens when the loudest storyteller is suddenly interrupted by a decade of monthly bank transfers. I won't raise my voice in this story. There won't be dramatic confrontations or villains twirling mustaches, just choices, patterns, and one decision that changed the way my family sees me, permanently. If you've ever been the dependable one, the low-maintenance one, the one people assume will just handle it, you might recognize parts of yourself here. Tell me, have you ever stayed silent so long that someone else started narrating your life for you? In my family, I was the capable one, not the brilliant one, not the dramatic one, not the favorite, just capable. If something needed organizing, I could handle it. If a form had to be filled out, I'd do it. If someone forgot to bring a dish to Thanksgiving, I'd quietly order takeout and plate it as I cooked it. No applause necessary. That was the understanding. My older brother, Marcus, was the charismatic one. He told stories loudly. He hugged people with big gestures. He forgot birthdays, but always had a convincing explanation. My younger cousin Lila was the sensitive one. My aunt described her as soft-hearted, which translated into everyone adjusted around her emotions. I was described as low maintenance. It sounds like a compliment. It isn't. Low maintenance means no one checks in because they assume you're fine. It means your silence becomes evidence that you don't need anything. It means when resources, time, money, patience are being distributed, your name isn't urgent enough to come up. When I moved from our hometown in Oregon to Seattle at 25, it fit perfectly into the story they already believed. Brooklyn's independent, my mother told relatives. She doesn't like to rely on anyone. What she didn't say was that I sent my first $600 transfer to them the month after I got my first full-time paycheck. It started small. My dad's hours had been cut at the warehouse. My mom's back pain was getting worse. They never asked directly. My mother phrased it like a weather report. Things are just tight right now. I remember standing in my tiny apartment kitchen, calculating my own rent, student loan payment, and grocery budget. I had maybe $200 of breathing room. I sent $150. The next month, I sent $300. By the end of that year, it stabilized at $500. There was no formal discussion, no family meeting, just an unspoken current that ran between my checking account and theirs. And because I didn't announce it, because I didn't frame it as a sacrifice, it blended into the background of my life. At holidays, Marcus would show up with a new smartwatch or talk about a weekend trip to Vegas. My parents would beam. "He works so hard," my dad would say. No one asked how my job was going. They assumed stable equaled satisfied. I learned early that if you don't narrate your contributions, someone else will narrate your absence. But at the time, I didn't feel absent. I felt steady. I felt useful. When extended relatives would say, "You're so lucky you got out," I would smile politely, as if moving 200 miles north had been an escape instead of an expansion, as if I wasn't still tethered financially every single month. I wasn't resentful. That's important. I genuinely believed that being reliable was enough, that quiet consistency would speak for itself, that someday, if there were ever confusion, the truth would be obvious. I didn't yet understand something simple. Consistency is invisible until it stops. And in my family, invisibility was the role I had been cast in long before I realized there was a script. The first time I felt it wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no slammed doors, just a sentence dropped casually across a dinner table. It was my mother's birthday. I had driven down from Seattle after work on a Friday, traffic thick and exhausting. I brought a cake from a bakery she liked, lemon with raspberry filling, and a card with a handwritten note inside. I also transferred the usual monthly $500 the morning before I left. We were halfway through dinner when my Aunt Carol said, "It's so nice that Marcus is here so often lately. Your parents need that." Marcus shrugged modestly. "Yeah, well, I try to help where I can." I remember looking up from my plate. "Help!" I didn't speak. I waited. My mom nodded. "He's been stopping by to fix things around the house. You know your father's knees aren't what they used to be." It was true. My dad's knees weren't what they used to be. That was part of why I had quietly increased the transfer to $650 3 months earlier after a surgery consult. No one mentioned that. I told myself it didn't matter. Physical presence counted. Of course it did. I lived in another city. I couldn't fix gutters or carry boxes up from the basement. But then my aunt added, "It's hard when one child moves away and the other one stays close." It was subtle, polite, almost sympathetic. But there it was. The first small cut moves away, as if distance equaled detachment. I took a sip of water and said lightly, "Seattle's not that far." "Of course not," she replied quickly. "But you know what I mean." I did know what she meant. I meant I wasn't visible. That night, after everyone went to bed, I stood in the hallway outside my childhood room and overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. Not arguing, just talking in that low, tired tone they use late at night. "At least Marcus tries," my mother said. My father responded, "Brooklyn's busy. She's always been focused on her own thing." There was no anger in his voice, just an assumption. Focused on her own thing. I went back into my room and sat on the edge of the bed. I opened my banking app out of instinct, not intention. The last transfer glowed back at me. $650, 3 days earlier. I felt something unfamiliar then. Not rage, not betrayal. Just a quiet disorientation. It wasn't that they were ungrateful. It was that they were unaware. And I had built that unawareness myself. I had never once said, "I'm covering the utilities this month." I had never once said, "I adjusted my budget so you wouldn't have to worry." I thought dignity meant discretion. But discretion, I was starting to see, creates informational gaps. And in gaps, stories grow. The next morning at breakfast, my mom thanked Marcus for bringing over a new lawnmower blade. She turned to me and said, "I know you're busy up there. Don't worry about us." I smiled. "Of course," I said. And that was the moment I realized something important. When someone says, "Don't worry," it doesn't always mean we're fine. Sometimes it means we've already decided you don't. After that birthday dinner, nothing dramatic changed. That was the part that made it so easy to ignore. The comments didn't escalate, they multiplied softly. At Thanksgiving that year, my cousin Lila hugged me and said, "It must be nice not having all the responsibility." I laughed lightly. "Responsibility? You know," she said, lowering her voice, "being here all the time. Marcus carries a lot." Carries. I pictured my checking account automatically scheduling the transfer on the first of every month. The consistency of it. The quiet hum of it. No one saw that kind of carrying because it left no visible strain on my face. I told myself she didn't know. That this wasn't malicious. Information shapes perception. If they didn't have the information, how could they shape it correctly? But what I didn't admit yet was this. I had started feeling erased. It happened in small social adjustments. When family group chats discussed repairs, no one tagged me. When my parents mentioned financial stress in conversation, they said it in a tone that implied isolation. "We're just figuring things out," my mom would sigh. I would nod. I wouldn't say I already helped figure part of it out. It became a strange dual existence. Publicly, the daughter who moved away. Privately, the daughter who stabilized the house. And because I never corrected the narrative strengthened. One afternoon, Marcus called me. "Hey," he said casually. "Mom mentioned the water heater might need replacing. I told her I'd look into it." "That's good," I replied. There was a pause. "You know," he added, "they don't like asking for help." I felt my jaw tighten slightly. "I know. You should call more," he said. Not accusatory, just advisory. "They miss you." I wanted to say, "I miss being acknowledged." Instead, I said, "I talk to Mom every week." "Yeah, but, it's different." Different. I began to notice how often that word was used around me, as if my contributions were from another category. Less tangible, less emotional, less present. I rationalized my silence. I told myself they're older. They value physical acts of service more. That's their love language. I told myself money is impersonal. It doesn't feel like love the way showing up does. I told myself if I speak up now, it will sound defensive. So I adjusted internally instead of externally. I started keeping cleaner records, not out of strategy, but out of habit. I labeled transfers more precisely. Utilities, March. Medical copay, Dad. Property tax assist, Q3. I didn't think of it as evidence. I thought of it as an order. At Christmas, my mom hugged Marcus tightly in front of everyone and said, "I don't know what we'd do without you." The room hummed in agreement. I stood nearby, holding a wrapped scarf I'd bought her. She turned to me and smiled warmly. Brooklyn's always been so independent. There it was again. Independent. Not supportive, not consistent, not generous. Independent. A word that slowly shifted from compliment to distancing device. And here's the part I need to say honestly. No one was screaming at me. No one was stealing from me. No one was plotting against me. But they were building a story, and I was letting them, because correcting it felt louder than I wanted to be. Because I believe that truth eventually surfaces on its own. I hadn't yet learned that truth. Without witnesses stays buried. Roles in families aren't usually announced. They're absorbed. Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, I had become the self-sufficient one. The one who didn't require reassurance. The one who would figure it out. When I was 12 and forgot my lunch at home, my mother didn't drive it to school the way she did for Marcus. She told me gently, "You're resourceful. You'll manage." When I cried over a math test in high school, my father patted my shoulder and said, "You're strong. Don't let small things shake you." At the time, I wore those labels like badges. Resourceful, strong, independent. What I didn't realize was that those words came with an invisible clause. Doesn't need. By the time I was in my 30s, the role had hardened. Marcus was present. I was stable. He was emotional currency. I was infrastructure. Infrastructure only gets noticed when it fails. I began to see how it shaped even small interactions. If my parents mentioned a bill being high, the comment would drift toward me, almost unconsciously. "Everything's getting expensive these days," my mom would say. It wasn't a request. It was atmospheric, and I would respond accordingly. I'd check my budget. I'd adjust. I'd send a little extra the next month. No acknowledgement, no discussion. Just continuation. Meanwhile, when Marcus assembled a bookshelf or drove them to an appointment, it was shared in detail. Photos in the family group chat. Praise. Gratitude. I don't blame him for that. Visibility creates appreciation. Physical acts are easier to frame. But what unsettled me was realizing that my silence had become part of the role. If I didn't mention what I did, then what I did didn't exist in the shared narrative. And there was a deeper layer to it. Being the independent one meant I was also the emotional buffer. If there was tension between Marcus and my parents, I was expected to smooth it over. If my mother vented about him, I listened. If he complained about their expectations, I listened. I absorbed. I translated. I never redirected the lens toward myself. One evening, during a phone call, my mother said, "We don't want to be a burden." It was the closest she had ever come to acknowledging the transfers directly. I responded quickly, almost automatically, "You're not." And I meant it. But what I didn't say was, "I'm not a ghost either." That was the quiet truth forming under everything. I had accepted the role of reliable provider without question because it aligned with my values. I believe in taking care of family. I believe in stability over spectacle. But somewhere along the way, reliable had morphed into invisible. And invisible is dangerous. Not because it hurts your ego, but because when a story forms in your absence, it rarely casts you accurately. I started to see that I wasn't just participating in a dynamic. I was sustaining it, and sustaining something doesn't mean endorsing it. It just means you haven't interrupted it yet. The shift didn't happen at a holiday dinner. It didn't happen during an argument. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, in the most unremarkable way possible. I was at my desk in Seattle reviewing quarterly expense reports, fluorescent office lighting, soft keyboard clicks around me. Nothing cinematic. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my cousin Daniel. the one who rarely reaches out unless there's news. Hey, just checking in. Heard things are rough between you and your parents. That's tough. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Rough. Between you and your parents. I typed back. What did you mean? 3 dots appeared, disappeared, reappeared. They said you told them you can't help anymore, that you need to focus on yourself. I mean, I get it. Just hope everything's okay. I didn't feel anger first. I felt stillness. A very specific kind of stillness. Like when you're underwater and everything goes muffled. I opened my banking app, scrolled. January, $700. February, $700. March, $750. Extra for a medical bill. April, $700. There had not been a single missed month in 10 years. Not one. I didn't call my parents immediately. I didn't send a defensive paragraph to Daniel. I didn't fire off a group message. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and let the realization settle. They weren't just misunderstanding my role anymore. They were rewriting it. Somewhere, at some gathering, in some conversation, I had become the daughter who refused to help. And here's the moment that mattered. I didn't feel the urge to shout. I felt the urge to gather. That was new. For years, my instinct had been to preserve harmony. Smooth edges, avoid friction. But this wasn't friction. This was documentation territory. I left work early that day and went home. I opened my laptop at my kitchen table. I logged into my bank's website on a full screen instead of my phone. I exported transaction histories year by year. Not out of rage, out of clarity. 10 folders, 10 years. Each is labeled carefully. I printed them. The pages made a steady, mechanical sound as they came out of the printer. Ordinary, almost boring. But as I stacked them neatly and clipped each year together, something inside me aligned. Not hardened, aligned. I realized that for a decade, I had equated silence with dignity. But dignity doesn't require invisibility, and truth doesn't defend itself. If someone is building a version of you that contradicts reality, and you remain silent, that silence eventually becomes endorsement. I sat there at my table, hands resting on a stack of paper that represented over $80,000 in transfers. Not as a weapon, as a record. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. What if the problem isn't that they don't know? What if the problem is that I've never required them to? That night, I didn't call anyone. I didn't confront. I simply slid the documents into a slim black leather portfolio I'd bought years ago for work presentations. I placed it on my bookshelf, and I went to bed knowing something had changed. Not in them, in me. After that Tuesday, my silence wasn't passive anymore. It was deliberate. There's a difference. Before, I stayed quiet because I didn't want conflict. Because I believed harmony was fragile and my role was to protect it. Because I thought that if I kept everything steady, eventually the truth would settle into place on its own. Now I stayed quiet because I was observing. When my cousin Daniel followed up with, "I'm sure you'll work it out," I responded simply, "Thanks." No correction, no explanation. When my mother called 2 days later, her tone was light. "We're managing," she said in that familiar, careful voice. "Don't worry about us." "I know," I replied evenly. I listened for hints, for admissions, for anything that would suggest awareness of what had been said. There was none. She talked about Marcus stopping by again to fix a cabinet hinge. She mentioned how helpful he'd been lately. There was pride in her voice. I felt something surprising, not jealousy, distance. I realized they had grown comfortable with a narrative where Marcus was the active son and I was the distant daughter. And because I had never disrupted that framing, it had matured into an assumption. I didn't accuse her. I didn't ask directly, "Why are you telling people I refuse to help?" Instead, I said something small and neutral. "I'm glad he's around." Silence on the other end. Then, "Yes, it's important." Important. So was rent. So were medical bills. So was property tax. But importance in my family had always been tied to visibility. That week, I made no changes to the transfers. The automatic payment remained scheduled. I didn't reduce it. I didn't increase it. I simply watched. I began to notice something else. The frequency of subtle positioning. An aunt posted a photo on social media of Marcus in my parents' kitchen, captioned, "So grateful for children who step up." I clicked like. Nothing more. Silence, when chosen consciously, creates space. And space reveals patterns more clearly. I realized I had 2 options. Option 1, correct the narrative loudly and risk being framed as defensive, dramatic, or transactional. She's throwing money in our faces. Option 2, allow the narrative to continue building, while preparing something that didn't require emotion to dismantle it. I chose option 2, not because I was afraid, but because I understood something about my family. They respond to proof more than persuasion. Emotion could be dismissed, documentation could not. So I continued living normally. I went to work, I met friends for coffee, I paid my own bills, I sent the monthly transfer. But internally, I had shifted from participant to archivist. Every interaction, every comment, every "don't worry about us" filed away. Not with resentment, but with precision. They mistook my calm for compliance. They mistook my silence for acceptance. What they didn't see was that silence, when intentional, is leverage gathering momentum, and I was no longer hoping the truth would surface. I was preparing to place it on the table. Preparation doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like spreadsheets. After that shift, I didn't rush into confrontation. I did something far less satisfying, but far more effective. I audited my own history. Every Saturday morning for a month, I sat at my dining table with coffee and my laptop. I went year by year, cross-referencing transfers with life events. 2016, Dad's knee surgery. Increased transfers for 6 months. 2018, property tax spike. 2 additional lump sums. 2020, pandemic slowdown. No missed payments. Not one. I created a clean chronological summary. Date, amount, memo line. Cumulative total. When I reached the 10-year mark, I stopped for a moment. Otsikiming tort use dollar. I stared at the number, not with regret, but with clarity. That wasn't resentment money. That was stability money. And what unsettled me wasn't the amount. It was how easily it had been erased from the family story. I didn't just prepare documents. I prepared the context. I reviewed old text messages, not to weaponize them, but to confirm patterns. Things are tight this month. We're just figuring it out. Don't stress yourself. Each message is aligned with a transfer within days. There was no dramatic plea from them. No written request that could be screenshotted and defended. The system we had built was subtle, almost polite, which made it easier to deny. I also examined myself. Had I ever clearly stated I am covering this? No. Had I ever asked for acknowledgement? No. Had I ever corrected someone when they implied I wasn't helping? Also no. My silence wasn't just protective. It was enabling. That realization didn't sting. It steadied me, because if I had helped build the dynamic, I could also reshape it. Without hostility. I began organizing everything into that slim black leather portfolio. Clear plastic sleeves, year dividers, a printed summary page at the front with a simple title, Monthly Family Support, 2015 to 2025. No adjectives, no commentary, just facts. Around this time, I heard through another cousin that my parents were worried about managing alone. Alone. The word caught my attention. I didn't react outwardly, but internally, I understood something important. The narrative had escalated. It wasn't just that I was distant, it was that I had withdrawn. And withdrawal implies previous presence, which meant somewhere the idea had formed that I stopped helping. That was inaccurate, but it was consistent with the story they preferred. One where Marcus was stepping up because I had stepped back. What they never noticed was this. While they were reinforcing a version of events built on emotion and proximity, I was building one built on timestamps. They never noticed that I stopped defending myself verbally. They never noticed that I stopped filling conversational gaps. They never noticed that when someone said, "It must be hard not being able to do more," I no longer smiled apologetically. I just said, "It's complicated," and left it there. Complicated invites curiosity. Silence invites projection. I let the projection continue, because I had learned something in finance years ago. If you interrupt too early, people argue. If you present the full ledger at once, they calculate. And calculation is quieter than argument. By the end of that month, my preparation wasn't emotional. It was structural. If a conversation happened, I would not raise my voice. I would not accuse. I would not defend. I would open the portfolio and let 10 years speak. They never noticed the shift because externally, nothing changed. The transfers continued. The calls remained polite. I showed up for the holidays. But internally, I was no longer hoping to be understood. I was preparing to be undeniable. The private reveal didn't happen in a room full of relatives. It happened alone, at my dining table on a quiet Sunday evening. I had just returned from another weekend visit to my parents' house. It had been uneventful in the way that only long-standing dynamics can be. Polite, predictable, slightly performative. Marcus had stopped by while I was there. He replaced a bathroom faucet and made a small production out of it, not arrogantly, just visibly. My mother hovered nearby, grateful. My father nodded in approval. At one point, my aunt called and asked to be put on speaker. "Thank goodness Marcus is there," she said warmly. You two would be lost without him. There was a brief silence. I was standing right there in the kitchen. No one corrected her. No one added context. I watched my own reaction carefully. I didn't feel humiliated. I felt finished. That was new. Not finished with my parents. Not finished loving them. Finished participating in a version of reality that excluded me. When I drove back to Seattle that evening, the sky was gray and flat. The kind of Pacific Northwest dusk that makes everything feel suspended. I didn't rehearse arguments in my head. I didn't craft speeches. I simply drove. When I got home, I set my keys down, poured a glass of water, and pulled the leather portfolio from the shelf. I opened it slowly. Year 1, Year 2, Year 3. Page after page of dates, amounts, confirmations. The cumulative total stared back at me again. $82,400. But this time, something shifted in how I saw it. It wasn't just money. It was proof of consistency. Proof that I had never withdrawn. Proof that if there was a rupture in the story, it wasn't created by the absence of action. It was created by the absence of acknowledgement. And here's the quiet realization that settled in. I didn't need them to feel guilty. I needed them to feel accurate. That difference mattered. If I confronted them emotionally, how could you say I don't help? The conversation would spiral into defensiveness. We didn't mean it that way. You're overreacting. We never said you don't care. But if I presented documentation, the conversation would have to shift from emotion to arithmetic. And arithmetic doesn't argue. I flipped to the summary page I had created. 10 years, no missed months. In fact, increases during hardship. I realized something else, something even more stabilizing. Even if they chose to reinterpret it, we never asked you to do that. The transfer still existed. Their narrative could bend. The numbers could not. That was my private reveal. Not to them, to myself. For years, I had equated love with invisibility. I believed that the purest form of support was the one that asked for nothing in return, not even acknowledgement. But acknowledgement isn't ego, it's accuracy. And accuracy protects relationships from distortion. I closed the portfolio and rested my hands on top of it. I wasn't excited. I wasn't nervous. I was clear. Clarity feels different than anger. It's cooler, more grounded. In that moment, I understood that I wasn't preparing to expose anyone. I was preparing to correct the record. And correction, when done calmly, is not aggression. It's alignment. The private reveal wasn't dramatic. It was simply this. I had the full ledger, and I no longer felt afraid to use it. There's a moment before you act where every option is still available. I reached that moment on a Wednesday evening, sitting at my kitchen counter with the portfolio open in front of me. I could continue as I had, sending money, staying silent, letting the narrative drift wherever it pleased. That option required the least friction. It preserved surface peace. It also guaranteed that eventually the story of Brooklyn Doesn't Help would solidify beyond repair. I could call my parents immediately and demand an explanation. Force a clarification, push for an apology. But I knew how that would unfold. We never said that. You're misunderstanding. Why are you keeping score? The conversation would shift from facts to feelings within minutes. And once people feel accused, they stop listening. There was a third option. I could stop the transfers without explanation. That would certainly create a tension. Bills would be noticed, gaps would surface, questions would come. But that would also confirm the very story I was trying to correct, that I had withdrawn support. No, if I moved, it had to be precise. I thought about what actually mattered to me. Did I want them to feel ashamed? No. Did I want public vindication? Not really. What I wanted was structural correction. I wanted the version of me being told at family gatherings to align with reality. And I wanted it done in a way that left no room for reinterpretation. That's when I realized the decision wasn't about whether to speak. It was about where. If this were corrected privately, it could quietly be reframed again later. If it was corrected publicly, but calmly, it would reset the narrative at its source. I checked the calendar. My parents' anniversary dinner was 2 weeks away. The extended family would be there. Cousins, aunts, my brother. The same audience that had heard I refused to help. The idea didn't feel theatrical. It felt appropriate, not a confrontation. A clarification. I imagined the moment. Not dramatic, not accusatory. Someone would inevitably mention how difficult things had been, or praise Marcus for stepping up. And I would say evenly, "Before we continue, I think there's something I should clarify." Then I would open the portfolio. No raised voice. No sarcasm. Just pages. But there was one more layer to the decision. If I did this, the dynamic would change permanently. You can't unknow documentation. Once numbers are introduced into a narrative built on assumptions, the room shifts. People recalculate. And I had to be ready for that recalculation to include discomfort, not just theirs, mine, because presenting proof means abandoning the comfort of invisibility. It means stepping out of the role assigned to you and risking resistance. I sat there for a long time, weighing it, and then I closed the portfolio gently and placed it back on the shelf. Decision made. I would not stop the transfers. I would not argue over the phone. I would wait. And when the moment came, I would let 10 years of consistency speak in a single, uninterrupted sequence. Not to win, but to correct. Some choices feel loud. This one felt quiet, but it was irreversible. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel adrenaline. I felt methodical. The next 2 weeks weren't about rehearsing what I would say. They were about tightening the structure around what I would present. I reviewed the portfolio again, this time as if I were someone else flipping through it. I removed anything unnecessary. No emotional notes, no highlighted frustrations, just dates, amounts, confirmations, and a clean cumulative total. I added one additional page at the front, a simple one-paragraph statement. From January 2015 through January 2025, I have transferred consistent monthly financial support to mom and dad. The attached pages reflect transaction dates, memo notes, and totals. I am sharing this only to correct the recent belief that I declined to help. No adjectives, no accusations. I printed it on plain white paper. I also did something else, something they wouldn't notice. I separated my support from the assumption. For 10 years, the transfers had been automatic, quiet, expected. I turned off the automatic scheduling, not to punish, to reset. From that point forward, if I continued helping, it would be through clear conversation, not silent obligation. That decision mattered more than the public moment, because documentation without boundaries is just proof of endurance. I didn't want to endure anymore. I wanted alignment. In the days leading up to the anniversary dinner, nothing outwardly shifted. My mother called to confirm the restaurant reservation. My aunt texted about seating arrangements. Marcus sent a casual message. "You coming down Friday or Saturday?" "Friday," I replied. No tension, no suspicion. If they sensed anything, they didn't show it. And I kept moving as I always had. Work, gym, grocery store, video calls with friends. But internally, something was steadying. I wasn't anxious about confrontation. I was curious about recalibration, because I understood something now. This wasn't just about money. It was about authorship. For years, I had allowed others to author my role in the family. Quiet, independent, distant. Now, I was preparing to insert a factual footnote into that story. Do not rewrite it entirely. Just anchor it. The night before I drove down, I placed the portfolio in my bag. It wasn't heavy. That surprised me. 10 years of evidence, and it felt light. Because weight doesn't come from paper. It comes from avoidance. And I was no longer avoiding. The anniversary dinner would not be dramatic. I wasn't planning a speech. I wasn't going to interrupt a toast. I would wait for the natural opening, the kind that always appears in families when hardship and gratitude are mentioned in the same breath. And when it did, I would speak calmly. One sentence, then pages. No anger, no performance, just a correction. The morning I left Seattle, the sky was clear. For the first time in months, I didn't feel invisible. I felt prepared. And preparation is a quiet form of power. The anniversary dinner began exactly the way I knew it would. Warm lighting, polite laughter, the low hum of overlapping conversations in a private room at a mid-range Italian restaurant my parents liked. My mother wore navy. My father looked proud and slightly uncomfortable with the attention. Marcus arrived 10 minutes late and was greeted like a celebrity. I watched all of it calmly. Halfway through the meal, my Aunt Carol tapped her glass lightly with a spoon. "I just want to say," she began, "it's been a hard few years for everyone, but seeing how this family pulls together, it's beautiful. Especially the way Marcus has stepped up." There it was. The opening. People nodded. Marcus smiled modestly. My mother reached for his hand. I didn't rush. I waited for the small pause after the applause, when attention naturally shifts. Then I spoke. "Before we move on," I said evenly, "I'd like to clarify something." My voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The table quieted. "I've heard recently that there's a belief I declined to help mom and dad financially. That's not accurate." There was immediate movement, small adjustments in posture. My mother blinked quickly. Marcus looked confused. I placed the black portfolio on the table and opened it. "For the past 10 years, I continued, I've sent consistent monthly transfers. I didn't talk about it because I didn't think it needed to be discussed. But since there seems to be confusion, I brought the records. I turned the portfolio so it faced outward. Page 1, dates, amounts, totals. The room didn't explode. It recalculated. My aunt leaned forward. What is that? It's a summary of transfers from 2015 to this year, I replied calmly. Just over $82,000 in total. No one spoke for several seconds. My father's face had gone pale, not with anger, but with something like disorientation. Marcus shifted in his chair. Wait, you never said... I know, I said gently. I chose not to. My mother's eyes moved across the pages, scanning the columns. I watched the exact moment recognition replaced assumption. You didn't refuse to help, she said quietly. No, so I answered. I didn't. There was no accusation in my tone, no follow-up sentence. I let silence do what silence does best, when it's placed after facts. It forces thought. The mood of the room changed, but not into hostility, into discomfort. Aunt Carol cleared her throat. Well, we didn't realize. I understand, I said. And I meant it, because they hadn't realized. That was the point. The narrative had formed in the absence of data. Now the data was present. No one argued with the numbers. No one dismissed them. There was no, you're exaggerating, because the pages were there. Physical, dated, concrete. My father finally spoke. Brooklyn, he said slowly. We never meant to make it sound like you weren't helping. I know, I replied again. I just wanted the record to be accurate. That was it. No raised voices. No tears. Just a correction. But here's what began in that moment. The consequence they didn't anticipate. The story shifted, and once a story shifts publicly, it cannot return to its previous version without obvious contradiction. Marcus wasn't diminished, but he was no longer singular, and I was no longer invisible. The dinner continued, but the recalculation had begun. The dinner ended politely. There were no dramatic exits. No one stormed out. Dessert was still served. Coffee is still poured. But something fundamental had shifted, and everyone could feel it. On the drive back to my parents' house that night, my mother sat unusually quiet in the passenger seat. My father drove. I was in the back, looking out the window at familiar streets that suddenly felt slightly unfamiliar. When we got inside, my mother turned to me. Why didn't you tell us? She asked. Her voice wasn't defensive. It was strained. I didn't think I needed to, I replied. I assumed you knew. My father exhaled slowly. We knew you helped sometimes. Sometimes. The word hung in the air. It's been monthly, I said gently. For 10 years. My mother sat down at the kitchen table, pressing her hand to her forehead. We never told people you refused, she said quickly. We just said you were focusing on your own life, and that I couldn't help, I added calmly. She didn't deny it this time. Instead, she said something that revealed everything. We didn't want people thinking we depended on you. There it was. Image management. In protecting their pride, they had unintentionally erased my contribution. And it was easier, my father admitted quietly, to talk about what Marcus does because it's visible. Visible. The word echoed in my mind again. I nodded slowly. I understand that. And I did. But understanding doesn't undo narrative damage. The next few days were awkward. My Aunt Carol called my mother. Then she called me. I feel terrible, she said. We had no idea. I know, I replied. Marcus texted me the next morning. Why didn't you ever say anything? I stared at that message for a long time. Because the answer was layered. I didn't say anything because I believe consistency spoke for itself. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to make love transactional. I didn't say anything because I was comfortable being quiet. But I also didn't say anything because being acknowledged felt unnecessary. Now I understand that acknowledgement isn't vanity. It's protection. You never asked, I finally texted back. That was the simplest truth. Over the following weeks, small attempts were made to recalibrate. My mother mentioned my support during a phone call with another relative. Intentionally, almost stiffly, Marcus became quieter in group chats about repairs. There were a few awkward "we appreciate everything you've done" comments that felt rehearsed. But here's the part that mattered. You can correct the record. You cannot erase the fact that it needed correcting. Something subtle had broken. Not love. Trust in the assumption. They had assumed I would remain silent indefinitely. And once that assumption collapsed, they had to confront something uncomfortable. The reliable one was not passive. The quiet one was not unaware. And the independent one had limits. It wasn't explosive. It was sobering. And sobering realizations don't reverse themselves. By the time I drove back to Seattle, the dynamic had shifted permanently. Not into hostility, into caution. They now knew I kept records, not just of money, of narrative. And once people know that, they speak differently. The real confrontation didn't happen at the restaurant. It happened a month later, at my parents' kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon. No audience, no clinking glasses, just the three of us. My mother had asked if we could talk properly. I agreed. The portfolio wasn't dramatic anymore. It wasn't even necessary, but I brought it anyway, not to reopen the evidence, just to signal something subtle. This conversation would stay anchored in reality. We sat down. My father folded his hands. My mother looked at me carefully, as if reassessing a photograph she'd owned for years. "We've been thinking," she began, "about how things got misrepresented." I waited. She continued, "We didn't mean to diminish what you've done." "I know," I said. And again, I meant it. Intent and impact are not always aligned. I understood that. My father cleared his throat. It was easier to talk about what we could see. That's the truth. "Yes," I replied, "I realize that." There was no accusation in my voice, just acknowledgement. My mother's eyes filled slightly, not dramatically, just enough to show weight. When people asked how we were managing, it felt uncomfortable to say our daughter was sending money every month. It made us feel dependent. Dependent. I nodded slowly. "I never wanted you to feel exposed," I said. "That's why I didn't talk about it." "And in not talking about it," she whispered, "we created a different story." Yes, there it was, clean, direct, no raised volume. For a moment, we just sat with that. Then I said something I had rehearsed only once in my head. "I'm not upset that you needed help. I'm not even upset that you felt uncomfortable acknowledging it. What I couldn't accept was being described as someone who refused." Silence. My father looked at me steadily. "That wasn't fair." "No," I agreed softly, "it wasn't." Marcus wasn't there that day. This wasn't about comparison anymore. It was about authorship. My mother reached across the table, not dramatically, just enough for her hand to rest near mine. "We were proud of you for being independent," she said. "We didn't realize that word could make you invisible." That sentence landed differently than the apologies, because it showed understanding, not just regret. "I don't need praise," I replied. "I just need accuracy." That was the entire point. Not gratitude parades, not emotional speeches. Accuracy. We talked practically after that, about finances, about expectations, about clarity. I told them I had turned off the automatic transfers, not as punishment, but as transition. "From now on," I said calmly, "if you need help, ask directly. And if I can, I'll say yes directly. No more atmospheric hints." My father nodded slowly. "That's fair." It was a simple agreement. No shouting, no ultimatums, just boundaries placed where assumptions used to live. When I left that afternoon, nothing felt dramatic, but something fundamental had shifted. They no longer saw me as the silent extension of stability. They saw me as an adult choosing to help, and choice changes everything. It's been a year since that dinner. The transfers didn't stop entirely. They changed. Now, when my parents need help, they call directly. "Can you cover this month's prescription? Would you be able to assist with the insurance deductible?" No coded language, no atmospheric sighs. And sometimes I say no. That was the biggest shift of all. Not because I want to withhold, but because I want my yes to be intentional, not automatic. Something else changed too. At family gatherings, when someone talks about how my parents are managing, the language is different. Both the kids help, my aunt says now. Not dramatically, not as overcorrection, just accurately. Marcus and I have recalibrated as well. There's less silent comparison, less invisible scoring. We talk more plainly. A few months ago, he said, "I didn't realize how much you were doing." "I didn't realize you didn't," I replied. It wasn't tense, it was clarifying. And here's what I've come to understand. I wasn't a victim of cruelty. I was a participant in my own erasure, not because I deserved it, but because I equated silence with strength. There's a specific kind of quiet dominance that doesn't look like control. It looks like documentation. It looks like boundaries. It looks like speaking once, clearly, instead of arguing repeatedly. I used to think power meant enduring quietly. Now I know it means correcting calmly. I don't feel bitter. If anything, I feel lighter. Because invisibility requires maintenance. You have to keep shrinking yourself to fit the role people are comfortable with. Clarity requires one moment of expansion. Just one. I still live in Seattle. I still work in financial operations. I still prefer observing to interrupting. That hasn't changed. What has changed is this. If someone begins narrating my life inaccurately, I don't rush to defend myself emotionally. I reach for facts, and I'm no longer afraid of being seen as someone who keeps track. Keeping track isn't petty. It's protective. I also see my parents differently now. They weren't trying to erase me. They were trying to protect their own pride, to preserve the image of self-sufficiency. In doing that, they misrepresented me, but once confronted with the truth, they adjusted. That matters. The quietest shift of all happened internally. I no longer confuse independence with invisibility. I can be independent and acknowledged, supportive and seen, calm and clear. Who I am now isn't louder. It's aligned. And alignment doesn't need applause. It just needs accuracy. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. Silence is not always noble. Sometimes it's generous, sometimes it's strategic, and sometimes it allows other people to write a version of you that isn't true. For 10 years, I believed that helping quietly was the highest form of love. No spotlight, no scoreboard, no reminders. But love without clarity can be rewritten. And once a narrative spreads, especially inside a family, it hardens quickly. What changed everything wasn't confrontation. It was documentation. Not to shame, not to humiliate, not to win, just to correct. Family lies don't always look like dramatic betrayals. Sometimes they look like softened omissions. Pride-adjusted storytelling. Half-truths repeated enough times that they feel whole. And when that happens, you have a choice. You can argue emotion with emotion, or you can place facts gently on the table and let silence do the recalculating. Quiet dominance isn't about overpowering anyone. It's about knowing exactly when to speak, and making sure that when you do, your words are anchored in something undeniable. I still help my parents, but now I help from a place of agency, not assumption. I still love my family, but now I also protect my narrative, because generosity should never require self-erasure. If you've ever been the low-maintenance one, the reliable one, the one who handles things without credit, I want to ask you something. Have you ever stayed silent so long that someone else rewrote your story? And if you did, what would happen if you calmly brought the receipts? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.